Boa noite, comunidade SPE. Como é que vocês estão? Eu espero que estejam todos bem. A gente está de volta aqui mais uma vez para a nossa Tech Tuesday. É uma série que a gente está trazendo palestrantes internacionais para falar de diversos temas aí atuais e importantes. Meu nome é José Sérgio, eu sou diretor de eventos da SPE. E como de praxe, a gente vai começar atualizando vocês sobre os nossos eventos e as próximas atividades que estão para acontecer aí na nossa comunidade. Então, vou pedir para compartilhar aqui a apresentação. Bom, pessoal, é claro que a gente tinha que começar já divulgando a próxima Tech Tuesday. A gente está com a série de apresentações muito interessantes e a próxima agora, para janeiro, dia 16 de janeiro, vai ser com a participação do Mike Cargill, que ele vai falar sobre a evolução dos poços subsea, o inglês The Evolution of Subsea Well Response. Vai ser uma apresentação muito interessante, de um tema importante, que a gente está começando, mais e mais a abordar aqui dentro da nossa comunidade. Ok? Outro evento muito importante, que a gente está se preparando para que ele aconteça agora, no início de 2024, é o Prêmio de Excelência Técnica e Profissional da Indústria da SPE, da nossa seção da SPE Brasil, conhecido também como SPE Brasil Award. Para vocês que são membros da SPE, para todos nós que somos membros, a gente já recebeu a notificação por e-mail, tem um forms com todas as instruções necessárias para que a gente faça a indicação daqueles profissionais que se destacaram ao longo do ano dentro da sua disciplina. Na verdade, em diferentes categorias. A gente tem a categoria técnica, que envolve as diversas disciplinas, categoria profissional, que vai desde o ensino à pesquisa, distinção em serviços para SPE, jovens profissionais, suporte corporativo e serviço ao público, e uma categoria de distinção, que busca aí promover diversidade na indústria de óleo e gás. Então, por favor, participem, indiquem aqueles colegas que se destacaram, para que eles possam participar e receberem aí um merecido reconhecimento pela atuação ao longo do ano de 2023. Eu tenho um grande prazer aqui de anunciar, e eu acho que é a primeira vez que a gente está anunciando na mídia, o encontro, na verdade, o simpósio estudantil da América Latina de 2024, realizado pela SPE Internacional e SPE Brasil. Esse ano, 2024, esse evento ele vai acontecer no Rio de Janeiro. Então, a gente vai ter participação de estudantes de toda a América Latina e Caribe, que é a região onde a nossa seção está inserida. E ele vai acontecer no dia 18 de maio, 18 e 19 de maio do ano que vem, 2024. Então, essa vai ser uma excelente oportunidade para os estudantes para compartilharem seus conhecimentos, buscarem se integrar mais às empresas, à indústria. A gente vai ter participação de empresas. E a gente vai ter também nesse evento o nosso Regional Student Paper Contest, que é um evento importantíssimo para os estudantes, onde cada estudante apresenta o seu trabalho, sua pesquisa a nível de graduação, mestrado e doutorado. E os ganhadores desse concurso, eles ganham prêmios. A gente vai ter o Petrobowl, que também é um evento muito bacana, uma espécie de quiz que se faz sobre conhecimentos relacionados às disciplinas e à própria indústria de petróleo. É um evento muito bacana, eu convido a todos para participarem e torcerem pelas universidades da América do Sul e Caribe, da América Latina e Caribe, que vão estar participando. Nós vamos ter apresentações para os estudantes, como eu mencionei, empresas serão convidadas, representantes dessas empresas para que possam vir falar aos estudantes. A gente quer criar aí essa ponte entre os estudantes que estão entrando na indústria e as empresas que estão precisando aí de mão de obra, de especializada, de pessoas para atuarem no nosso ramo, na indústria de petróleo. A gente vai ter também uma feira de carreiras, ou seja, vamos ter stands dessas empresas, de algumas empresas, onde através desses stands os estudantes vão poder conversar diretamente com representantes de RH, profissionais, dessas empresas. Então é um evento muito bacana, a gente está preparando ele com bastante carinho, a gente espera que vocês participem, tá bom? Ainda agora em 2023, em dezembro, no dia 12 ao dia 15, a gente tem um encontro Potiguar de Petróleo, sexto encontro Potiguar de Petróleo, realizado aí pela UFRN, pelo capítulo estudantil da SPE na UFRN. É um evento também bem importante, realizado por estudantes com participação de representantes tanto das universidades como das empresas, e eu convido vocês a participarem e maiores detalhes vocês podem encontrar representantes do capítulo por meio das mídias sociais, né, LinkedIn, Instagram. Então fiquem à vontade de entrar em contato, que eu tenho certeza que as suas perguntas serão respondidas com todo carinho, né? Esse ano de 2024 é um ano muito especial para a SPE Internacional. A maioria de vocês deve conhecer o ATCE, né, que é o Annual Technical Conference and Exhibition, que é um dos eventos mais importantes da SPE, e no ano de 2024 ele faz 100 anos que ele acontece. Esse ano, que é um ano especial, vai tratar de um tema muito importante, que é o empoderamento do futuro da energia em um século de inovação. Então, temas bastante atuais serão tratados nessa conferência, que vai acontecer de 23 a 25 de setembro de 2024, e eu convido vocês não só a se prepararem para estar lá presencialmente, para esse evento tão importante, como para submeter seus trabalhos, seus artigos técnicos, para contribuir, né, para esse evento que é sempre de elevadíssima qualidade, com participantes de universidades, indústrias, empresas prestadoras de serviços, operadoras. Então, vale muito a pena. Então, vamos nos preparar e, quem sabe, a gente não se encontra lá no ano que vem, né? Bom, então eu vou passar agora para o meu colega Pierre. A gente vai dar início à nossa Tech Tuesday, e para isso a gente vai mudar agora para o inglês, tendo o prazer de receber a Ruth Thomas. Por favor, Pierre, fica à vontade.
Greetings, season's greetings to all. It's a pleasure to be with you for this last Tech Tuesday of 2023. I will now say a few words about Ruth. She has an extensive experience in E&P, 22 years as a geophysicist for a number of operators, including CNR International, Apache, Talisman Energy, and Repsol Sinopec. As she told me, she claims to be and assumes to be a total geology geek, loving everything rocks, sometimes to the annoyance of her family. And then following a number of redundancy rounds and surviving those, we do live in a cyclic prone industry. She decided to study for an additional degree, a Master in Science in Decommissioning through the University of Aberdeen, after which she joined WellSafe Solutions, their subsurface manager, in November of last year, with the aim of developing WellSafe subsurface offering and driving forward optimized and cost-effective P&A for decommissioning and energy transition projects. So I had the pleasure of meeting Ruth at the excellent SPE Aberdeen Decom event in June, and I really liked her presentation, and I thought it was definitely worth broadening the audience. So we're very happy to share this with you today. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Pierre, for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak to you all about my favourite subject, the subsurface base of design for abandonment, and why I believe it's the most important part of the well decommissioning process. You'll have to bear with me, I've got a bit of a throat thing going on, so I'll be a bit husky during this presentation, but hopefully I'll struggle through. So yeah, as Pierre mentioned, I joined WellSafe Solutions just over a year ago. And at the time, there were a few questions around why on earth is a company which specializes in P&A, why are they hiring a geophysicist? Well, hopefully after this short presentation, I'll be able to give you some insight into that decision and hopefully inspire you to reach out to the subsurface resources in your organization as well. So what we're going to cover in the next sort of 30 minutes, we'll look at a little bit of industry context. We'll look at the role of subsurface in P&A and also the process of creating a subsurface basis of design for abandonment. We'll look at some of the challenges associated with that process and how this can drive optimization of your well P&A design. So just a little bit of context to start with. Obviously, decommissioning oil and gas infrastructure in Brazil is a massive new frontier business with a high number of very old assets like the North Sea, but very optimistic plans and financial commitments to decommissioning over the next sort of half decade. But decommissioning in your industry in Brazil is fraught with challenges, least of all the remoteness of the infrastructure in the wells, the deep waters, but also the numerous players in both the environmental and the legislative space. So how can we really drive optimization of P&A in such challenging conditions? In the UK, we are some way down that decommissioning curve, and we have an ever-increasing spend of $2 or so billion every year. And well, P&A accounts for about 50% of that spend, so it's significant. As you can see on the right-hand side here, we have a graphic which illustrates the costs associated with decommissioning wells in individual categories. And as you can see, the costs of decommissioning subsea and exploration and appraisal wells is not decreasing year on year, it's actually increasing. So why is this? Inflation aside, are these wells just more complex to decommission? Are there more unknown unknowns? Are well duty holders perhaps a little risk averse when it comes to their P&A solution and maybe unnecessarily over-engineering a P&A solution? Or are we just better able to leverage the learning curve to platform wells? Probably all of the above, but if you want really cost-effective and optimized well plug and abandonment, you need to start from the ground up, pun intended. So what is the role of subsurface in P&A? What do they do? Who are they? And why do they do it? Well, we're all familiar with geoscientists in their roles in exploration, appraisal, and development drilling. But the unique skill set that they possess is as important during a field's abandonment as it was during a field's productive life. And it's a truly multidisciplinary set of individuals. We have geology, geophysics, geomechanics, petrophysics, reservoir, petroleum, and wells engineering. And it's their job to come together and do the analyses which create the subsurface basis of design for abandonment. And this forms the foundation upon which all of the subsequent well engineering is based. So what is a subsurface basis of design for abandonment, and why is it important? Got a handy little graphic here on the right-hand side just to illustrate some of the points, because essentially it's a document which outlines the overarching subsurface criteria for isolation of permeable zones deemed as having sustained flow potential. Okay, everyone's head is blown. Let's break this down into easy to manage blocks. Permeable zone. In essence, a permeable formation is one which is proven to have permeability and porosity, either through direct measurements or through inferred through lithology, for example, a sandstone. Flow potential arises when these zones exhibit a pressure differential and could be connected via the well or by any geological faults. And if there is enough energy in the system and there is sufficient pressure differential to drive fluids into other zones through these elements, either through the wellbore or the formation, this is called crossflow. Ultimately, the aim of the subsurface basis of design for abandonment is to reduce the risk of this happening to as low as reasonably practicable. That's ALARP. So what are the regulations regarding the subsurface basis of design for abandonment? Well, actually, in short, there's very little. Most countries, as you'll probably be aware, have regulations regarding the integrity of wells in the context of the well life cycle. So that's from initial drilling all the way through to abandonment. But the maturity of specific regulations relating to decommissioning is generally linked to the maturity of the decommissioning industry in that country. In the UK, well duty holders have to comply with the design construction regulations, which prescribe that we have to make sure that all wells can be safely suspended and abandoned with no unplanned release of fluids to surface. The OEUK, which is a sort of an organization which provides advice to the industry, have developed a guidance which is a bit more prescriptive in terms of giving advice around barrier lengths and means of verification of barriers. Whereas, as I believe in Brazil, the Resolution 46/2016 uses more sort of goal-setting language around the objective of containment and using ALARP. But all guidance that I've seen has fallen some way short of giving you a defined process in terms of how to conduct a subsurface review. So we'll take a look at that next. So what are the steps? How long does it take? Well, generally, the duration of a subsurface basis of design for abandonment is commensurate with the complexity of the geology, of the wells, and also the availability or not of data. But generally, it follows a 6-stage process, starting with a data review. This is quite a lengthy process of data mining, quite often going back to the archives to get original information about the drilled wells, but it's essential and it's part of the process which completely underpins all of the following processes. Once we have all of our data in place, we can understand our permeable zones. So what zones do we have that require additional information in terms of their porosity and permeability, their fluid, and their pressure content? This allows us to understand what is permeable, but crucially what's impermeable. The impermeable zones are really important because these are our cap rocks. These are where we need to set our isolation plugs. We need to understand the pore pressure and fracture gradients associated with the drilled formations. This can be derived from many acquired data, but crucially we need to bring all this data together, and not just for the well to be abandoned or series of wells, but for offset data in order to understand the real range on the data, and we'll come to that a bit later on as well. This allows us to calculate a really key variable, which is the minimum safe abandonment depth. This is the depth above which the cap rocks are of insufficient strength to withstand the pressure exerted by the fluids in the reservoir. We then can go on to understand our zonal isolation philosophy. What requires to be isolated from each other and from the surface? What is the likelihood of crossflow? What is going to be the pressure recharge of the reservoirs in perpetuity? And this gives us a real understanding of our isolation strategy. We also need to understand the risks, not just the risks associated with the subsurface, like shallow gas, H2S, etc., but we also need to understand the risks of the chosen abandonment on any future reuse or redevelopment of the strata or the reservoirs, and carbon capture and storage is one of those opportunities. Finally, we come up with our well abandonment strategy. This involves all of the stakeholders associated with those abandonments, so the well duty holder, the people executing the work, and the well engineering, to come up with a fit-for-purpose abandonment. But we don't tend to do this in isolation. We can do this process to build our subsurface basis of design for abandonment, which then forms the foundation upon which the well engineering piece is matured. But as the well engineering piece matures and the well abandonment basis of design develops, things can sometimes be thrown into the mix, whereby we have to go back and look at the subsurface basis of design and come up with a plan B. But if I were to give any piece of advice tonight, it would be 3 things. Well engineers tend to like to have similar data to subsurface people, so that's really one thing to concentrate on. They also need to understand the cap rocks available to them, where they can set their isolations. So that's a really important part of this process. And then, as we've spoken about, the minimum safe abandonment depth. What are the boundaries and how are we going to achieve the isolation sufficiently? Ideally, what you also want to produce is something called a plumbing diagram. And this is a cartoon, really, which marries the well configuration in its very simplistic form with a simplified geology, showing those permeable zones, those cap rocks, and any other geological features. And it's a really great way of understanding the key elements to the system that you're trying to abandon. You can add in a bit more detail, potentially around what plugs are already in place, what issues there are, but also it means that we all have the same conversation around ensuring that we have vertical and lateral containment of the entire system, and we're not working in a postage stamp. So what are some of the challenges associated with a subsurface basis of design, and where is optimization possible? So we've got 4 here today. We've got data or lack thereof, subsurface uncertainty, managing risk, and flying solo. And we'll take each of these in turn. So data or lack thereof, as I like to call it, the race to the reservoir. The bit between the seabed and the reservoir, that's your overburden, also known as your caprock. However, the least important bit in exploration and appraisal drilling is the most important bit in P&A. And a lack of understanding of this interval can impact your abandonment design quite drastically. We often acquire gamma ray, if we're lucky, sonic data from surface, and we potentially collect cuttings from 500 feet or so. But as the logs become more and more useful, we tend to acquire less and less of them until we only have a full suite of logs across the reservoir interval. And the overburden can be really complex. As you can see from the seismic line on the right-hand side, we have many elements that can impact the effectiveness of our caprocks. We have polygonal faulting zones, so heavily faulted zones as a result of dewatering. We can have regional sandstones that sometimes connect wells in the shallow zones, and we can have gas hazards, for example. Good caprocks are laterally continuous, they're thick, they're extensive, they're crucially homogeneous. But as you can see from the graphic, that's not always the case. And often we make assumptions around caprocks that can be misleading. The isolation windows are a key deliverable from the subsurface base of design, but actually in reality, we can have a lot less of it to use at our disposal for abandonment purposes. So moving on to subsurface uncertainty. Without hard data, we introduce uncertainty. And really what's going on here between these clusters of points? Without data, we have to make assumptions and give a range of outcomes. And I'm going to give you an example of how we did that on a recent project. So this is a well that we have just finished abandoning for a client in the central North Sea, in the North Sea. Decom 22. The well was drilled in 1998 and it was suspended with 5 plugs, 3 across the primary reservoir, 1 across the chalk interval, and then a suspension plug. The well encountered a Fulmar reservoir, which was oil bearing, and there is also a secondary reservoir in the shallow zones, which is connected to a nearby field, and there's currently offtake happening from that field. The lower reservoir was HPHT conditions, so 15,000 psi at 12,500 feet TVD subsea and 360 degrees Fahrenheit. But it was never developed, and so we can assume that this reservoir is still at virgin pressure. Sorry, I should say that none of the plugs here were tagged or tested, so there was some ambiguity around how effective these were. So the planned abandonment, as per the basis of design, was to drill out plug 5 to re-enter the well, to automatically drill out plug 4, which was set across the chalk interval, and to go and tag and test plug 3. If it was good, we would top up this plug, but if it was bad, we would have to drill it out. And like I said, that did mean that you ran the risk of encountering virgin reservoir pressure. The planned abandonment was then going to be to set or top up that primary reservoir barrier. And then according with the OEUK regulations, we had to set a plug to isolate water from oil-bearing sandstones in the secondary reservoir, and then we would set an environmental plug for wellbore containment. So during the subsurface base of design for abandonment process, you can see I've added on the right-hand side here a plot, which is your pore pressure fracture gradient plot. Everyone will be familiar with these for drilling in terms of deriving what pore pressures we're likely to encounter in the well. And we're back to having clusters of data with big gaps in between them. So with this, we have to draw on trends. So we can add a pore pressure trend. Our pore pressure is being derived from RFT, MDT, DST data, or from sonic or resistivity logs. We can add on our fracture gradient pressure. And this comes from our direct measurements during drilling, our leak-off or extended leak-off tests, our formation integrity tests. But again, we have to make assumptions. As you can see on the data here, there is a range of points and a range of data inputs, but we have to make an assumption. when you add on our oil gradient lines from the top of the reservoirs, the intersection point with the fracture gradient dictates this minimum safe abandonment depth I referred to earlier. And again, this is the depth above which the caprock is not of sufficient strength to act as a seal. So it's a really important thing to get right. However, getting it right is sometimes a little tricky. In this instance, we were provided the pore pressure and fracture gradient trends by the client, and they'd taken a sort of a middle of the road approach. They'd given us the most likely fracture gradient, and that's in a blow up section here on the left hand side. And you can see that the intersection point of the oil gradient with the fracture gradient gives you a minimum safe abandonment depth, which is just beneath the base of this plug 4. So in this instance, if we were looking at this in isolation, we would have to drill out this plug because it doesn't comply with regards to the minimum safe abandonment depth. However, as a geoscientist, I love to add in a bit of data, and looking at the low case fracture gradient, so adding in a range on the data set, actually the situation doesn't improve. The minimum safe abandonment depth, as you can see, has lowered and is even further away from allowing this plug to remain in place. However, if you encompass the high case fracture gradient, and again, this is encompassing the entire range of the data, the minimum safe abandonment depth moves upwards. Upwards so that the base of this plug is now beneath the minimum safe abandonment depth, and in theory, would be able to withstand the pressure being exerted from the reservoir fluids. So in a way, this is just demonstrating how the range of possible minimum safe abandonment depths as calculated using the range on the data, it was sufficient in this instance to take a relook at the operational steps. So what did the optimized abandonment look like? We would still go in and drill out plug 5 to re-enter the well, but we would go and tag and test plug 4. If it was holding pressure and there were no issues, we would leave it in place. And this would remove the lower scope entirely. We also then did the detailed evaluation of the geology around this reservoir number 2, and we discovered that there wasn't sufficient caprock in order to isolate between oil and water-bearing sandstones. And so we were just placing one plug here inside the 13 3/8 shoe. So that simplified this scope as well. As you can see, we saved some money for the clients, but crucially, we actually reduced operational risk significantly because we weren't exposing the well, the formations, and the rig to that virgin pressure, which was HPHT. So the next challenge, managing risk, the less than perfect abandonment solution. So what do I really mean by that? It's the difference between what we'd like to do versus what we can realistically achieve, operationally achieve. So the subsurface basis of design for abandonment may require us to set an isolation just above the reservoir to stop cross-flow of hydrocarbons into shallower sandstones, for example. But what if you can't do that? What if the risk is of re-entry into the well is just too high? Often the risk profile of the well duty holder strongly influences their ability to buy into a less than perfect P&A solution. But we really need to keep ALARP in mind when it comes to this. And I'm going to give you an example of how we did that in a recent project. So this field, which encompasses 9 wells across the entire field, is really old. It's a very well-established field in the North Sea. It's about 40 years old, and nearly all of the wells that penetrate the field are in really poor condition in terms of their integrity. There's a lower reservoir, which is in the Devonian, and then a very small, shallow accumulation just in the Paleocene interval above the field. The original field was overpressured, but it's been heavily depleted by about 4,000 psi due to production. The initial subsurface basis of design for abandonment was done by the subsurface team in the client's office back in 2017, so some time ago now. And just zooming in a little bit on the completion area within the well, you can see that the minimum safe abandonment depth, which has been calculated for the primary reservoir, sits just beneath this hydroset production packer, which is in the well. And that's key, and I'll come on to speak about why that is in a second. This is the plumbing diagram associated with the field. And again, we've got this lower, very prolific Devonian reservoir. We have the overburden, which is very sandy in this instance. And in between, we have the chalk, which is common throughout the North Sea and is commonly forms part of our cap rock. You can see that there's been a few issues with the field over the years. We've had an underground blowout, and there's only one of the appraisal wells which has actually been plugged off. So the rest of the well stock is open and ready for abandonment. And just zooming in a little bit on this interval, you can see the minimum safe abandonment depth is calculated to be beneath this, the depths associated with these production packers. So the idealized abandonment was to remove the production tubing and that hydroset production packer. We were then going to mill a window in the 7-inch liner and set a rock-to-rock barrier across the shale cap rock there. We would then look at the shallow zones and verify the annular seal in the wells and set a secondary barrier where required. However, and it's a big however, as the well engineering piece progressed in 2022, so some years later, the integrity issues that were identified in the well meant that we had to have a complete rethink of the abandonment. The removal of these hydroset production packers was deemed to be almost impossible, and it could have ended up in sidetracking the well or having to set barriers well above the minimum safe abandonment depth, so in essence not isolating the primary reservoir. So what did we do? We held a workshop with the client with all the stakeholders in place. We called it an alert workshop. And really that was designed to enable everybody who was involved in designing the abandonment to sit in the same room and come up with a plan B. And the plan B looked like this. It was basically to leave the packer in place and to do a through tubing plug. However, that did mean that we couldn't log the well prior to setting the barrier, and therefore we wouldn't be able to make sure that the annular isolation, so the annular cement, was good enough to act as a barrier to any migration of hydrocarbons through any microannulus that may be present. So the subsurface was brought back into the frame again. We had to go away and do a shale annular barrier study to actually look at the mineralogy of the shales in this section and look at their likely swelling and creeping potential to ensure that we had some idea whether or not the annular isolation was verifiable. We were also tasked with looking at crossflow and crossflow from the reservoir into the shallower zones should any of these barriers fail in the future, and quantifying the level of risk involved. So this was really just an example of how the subsurface base of design for abandonment was completed in 2017. And yet in 2022 and 2023, it was brought back into the fore and was actually used to enable a plan B to be devised for abandonment of this field to ensure, crucially, that we have not just vertical but lateral containment. So managing risk, how do we do that in the subsurface based of design for abandonment? Ideally, and if you have the resources, you acquire data in advance of P&A, whether that's pressures, samples, if you can acquire logs, again, to fill in the gaps really about your overburden and to ensure that you have the data that you need to optimize your abandonment. We need to have a plan B, or even better, a plan C when it comes to abandonment. There are so many unknown unknowns when you come to operations. Some things you've never even considered and the operator is also unaware of. So having an alternative and getting buy-in from all the crucial stakeholders and the acceptance criteria defined upfront will save a lot of time and heartache and money in terms of management of change during operations. The last challenge we face is flying solo. Everybody likes to hang around with people that speak the same language as they do. However, silos, despite being commonplace, have to be overcome if you really want to optimize P&A and get everybody working in the same room. In WellSafe, we have the subsurface team and the well engineering team sat together, co-located, having those conversations and drawing those plumbing diagrams. We also need to have dedicated resources for P&A. I always akin it to having a Lego head that you kind of pop on and off. If your team are distracted with barrel adding opportunities, that will always come first, and P&A will always be something that people will kick down the road. I believe it's really important to build relationships and technical understanding between subsurface and between well engineering. This enables us to actually speak each other's languages and go forwards with a P&A design which everybody can get behind. And subsurface people really need to communicate the uncertainty early. We're really good at this in exploration and appraisal drilling. We should apply it also to P&A. So in summary, P&A needs to be optimized if we're going to ever reduce the costs of plug and abandonment of wells. The subsurface team developed the subsurface BOD, which underpins the P&A design, but there are many challenges along the way, including a lack of data, managing risk, and uncertainty. But optimization can save you time, it can save you money, but crucially, it can reduce operational risk. The perfect abandonment solution is not always possible. You need to plan for it. You need to have a narrative around it, and it needs to be communicated to all the stakeholders. Finally, collaboration, I believe, is key to success. And I want to send you away with one final thought. New bits of kit on the rig during a P&A, during the execute phase, can maybe save you tens of thousands of dollars. New plugging technology or optimizing operational steps during select phase can save you maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. But barrier optimization via a bespoke subsurface space of design for abandonment in the define stage can be a game changer, and it can save you many, many millions of dollars. And that's it. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruth, for such a good presentation. It's a really good one, and I'm happy you could present it to us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we can take questions from the audience, and I'll get it started with a few comments or reflections on what you mentioned. I completely agree that the integration is absolutely key. There's no such bad plan as a plan you cannot execute, actually. So yeah, realistically, planning for delivery is needs to happen. There's a layer that does need to happen in the basis of design. And then maybe the lessons learned. So the plumbing diagram I thought was very good, and then sharing lessons about integrity issues regionally can also really help plan for a campaign, etc. But it's not necessarily easy to get that.
No, absolutely not. I definitely think that the role of the in our case the client, but the operator, is absolutely key, because they know the wells better than anyone else. They know the subsurface better than anyone else. And having clear communication between those executing, what those planning for, and defining and engineering P&A and the operator is absolutely key. And I think it's not always happening. Those conversations aren't always very easy. I think particularly coming in as a third party, which WellSafe do, there's quite a lot of skepticism in terms of our ability to be able to design a P&A when we are not the well duty holders. We're not the ones with the liability. So it's really building trust, and it's building those relationships between client, between people executing, between people on the rig, between the subsurface. It's a whole melee of relationships that you need to build.
Yes, Ruth. I must tell you that, as you said, you blew my mind a little bit here with your presentation. Great presentation. I'm a reservoir engineer, right? So I'm used to see the decommissioning as that step far in the future.
Yes.
Not really far in the future. So, we'll see when we get there, right? But we're getting there already. So we must see how should we do and how to do its best, right? And the way you explained it here in your presentation, I actually understood that P&A for a given well during the commission is as important as drilling and completing a well. You need to put as much work as you've done in the beginning of your project. So that's truly important and truly interesting, because by having the data that sometimes you don't need, we must have a lot of data, right? We are at the end of the life of the field, but we might not have the right data, the data we actually need. As you said, geomechanics is really important, so we must have many data to model. And we do have be aware that there should be other opportunities for those reservoirs that we are abandoning, for example, CCS, CCUS, and we must worry about how we've done our P&A. And that was truly interesting. And I want to ask you, and I hope it's not a silly question, it's kind of off of my area, but do we have companies already using, and by companies I mean either service companies providing consultancy, operators that are already looking into the well P&A issue with that subsurface base of design philosophy?
Yeah, so every operator, because it's not prescribed, it's not a prescriptive set of regulations, which is good in many ways, because obviously the one size fits all approach doesn't work for well P&A. Everything's bespoke, but everybody approaches it differently. And in my experience, and I've seen a lot of different types of subsurface base of design, from the very light touch to the very, very detailed, potentially maybe too detailed, in that it's not translatable into the well engineering space. They don't understand the relevance of a lot of the detail. So it's finding that sweet spot, really, so that you cover all the main bases. You're looking at your rocks in detail, and I call it forensic geoscience, because that's what it is. You're going back to original data, and you're having to make assumptions around, what does the reservoir look like now? Often these reservoirs have been shut in for a period of time. There's been, a lack of focus as operations wind down to COP. And in terms of, reservoir recharge, as a reservoir engineer, you'd be familiar with, how do you model that in the future? There's a lot of ambiguity in terms of how valuable these models are and how well they're built. Are they kept up to date? So yeah, there are lots of companies that do this, operators as well, but it's all to different sort of parameters, and everybody has their own flavor of subsurface base of design. I always look at it as if I was, when I do this sort of piece of study work, I'm always living in fear. That's how I've always approached it. The fear of being found out to have done something wrong. So I always go in there and try and get a lot of detail in there and really understand the reservoirs and understand the implications on the abandonment. So I'm probably at the other end of the spectrum. But there's some instances where it's just a wells basis of design, and there is really very little subsurface input. I was down in Australia last week, probably hence the very hoarse voice, and I had a gentleman come and speak to me after a presentation. He said, "Why do we need subsurface people at all? Surely we just set a plug just above the reservoir." He was a reservoir engineer, but I was like, "Oh, okay, well, I think I might need a drink for this one." So we had a good discussion.
Yeah, we do need as much as a multidisciplinary team, yes, as I've mentioned before, doing the P&A as we had when we were choosing locations and drilling new wells for our projects, right? And it also go on, Pierre, go on.
No, so on the complexity, it's kind of funny that Ruth opened the discussion talking about the regulatory framework and how it was probably a bit weak on the review and the subsurface basis of design. However, considering, if you put it in practice, if you apply it, it's hard to give a recipe for everything you have to do. The most powerful illustration of that is to go through cases and show, how complicated it actually is. On top of that, your basis of design is not necessarily fixed in time, and that's where the plumbing diagram becomes very relevant, because you can have charging happening in some shallower layers over time, etc. Compaction, which will affect the survivability of some of the wells and leave some open conduits, faults that might suddenly, become activated. So no, it's not simple. I don't know how you could manage.
No. I guess what we're trying to do there is make sure that we are using the ALARP principle. We need to demonstrate that we have done enough technical work and we have as good an understanding as we are going to have in terms of the subsurface and how that translates to your isolation strategy. But I mean, you bring up, the reuse of reservoirs, and I don't have a crystal ball, and the guidelines and the legislation don't give you any help in terms of saying, you must abandon with reuse for CCS, for example, in mind. I know in the UK we've definitely made steps towards that. We've got the OEUK CO2 guidelines, and in every subsurface base of design that we do, we always ensure that we understand any potential reuse. But there's no onus on operators to abandon for CCS, for example. If someone comes along later on and jacks up the reservoir pressure, there is, until somebody is told to do something, until it's mandated, they won't do that. And we're seeing a lot of these legacy well issues in the North Sea, where obviously in the southern North Sea there's a lot of CCS potential. And we're having to look at the abandonments and go, oh my goodness, okay, well that shallow reservoir hasn't been abandoned, and therefore there's a direct path all the way up to seabed. That's where your CO2 will be going. So it's I wish I did have a crystal ball when it came to that. But I guess we just have, it's best endeavors, isn't it, when it comes to this kind of work. You just have to be satisfied that you are demonstrating that you've definitely tried to quantify it as best you can.
Yes, and as the multidisciplinary approach is always best, right? Because having subsurface and other disciplines looking into risk management, in our P&A, it's truly important, as you mentioned. CCS, CCUS as an opportunity. If you don't do it right now, you're gonna have to do it again, right? In order to be able to store some CO2 and even explore this new business and all. What caught my attention when you've talked about risk, it caught my attention that the risk in that kind of project should be evaluated in short, mid, and long-term view, right? How you showed some examples, and how have you managed? How was that experience on planning the P&A, having to have that broad view of risks and risks? We want to actually think of all of them, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, short-term risks are already hard to capture all, but short, mid, and long-term, how did you manage in your experience?
So in the example I gave of the second field, where we were doing the overarching field abandonment of those 9 production wells and a couple of exploration wells, the risks, the immediate risks, were really very present in terms of we were going to be operating under loss conditions. So that really impacts your operational steps. And we weren't sure what reservoir pressure we were going to get when we went into that. In fact, we're literally on site now about to start the abandonment campaign. We still don't know what the reservoir pressure will be. So there are those sort of very imminent and very present risks. But in terms of the sort of longer term, obviously the subsurface base of design for abandonment feeds into the wells basis of design. And this is really where the risk assessment comes in and is really very much fledged out. The subsurface risks, as I mentioned, relate to the formations. They relate to potential reuse. They relate to re-entry well problems. But it's during that combined stage where you're actually going in and saying, okay, what are the operational steps for these wells, and categorizing the risks and trying to get the operator over some of these hurdles in terms of risk and accepting that some risks are just present. In that particular example, we were going to have to try and mill out these packers. So we actually got everybody in the room. We had a milling expert sat there. We had an integrity expert, and we had these conversations regarding the risks associated with certain operations. But it was challenging, really challenging. But we did get over the line with the client in the end. But yeah, the risk of the abandonment in perpetuity, like I said, I don't have a crystal ball, nobody does, but you just have to, it's just best endeavors for sure. And the well examiner and the regulator in the UK are fairly open when it comes to a discussion. The abandonment philosophy on that particular example was not ideal. It wasn't perfect, but it was achievable, and therefore reduced the risk of any real problems had we tried to do Plan A, which was milling out those packers.
Great, thank you.
And I think this illustrates really the discussion on risks and the questions you asked, Sergio, on short term, long term, shows how sometimes you probably have to balance those, because the execution itself creates a potential immediate threat to people delivering the P&A, versus a probability of failure at some point, or something happening later which might not be win that decision. On the abandonment in perpetuity, and any thoughts on for me, the only really good news today would be some research and encouraging data that we find about halides or shale to potentially cure and then act as a virtuous cap rock that might be able to compensate for shortcomings. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely an evolving piece in the North Sea, particularly, and North Sea in general, so UK and Norway. And it's definitely something that has massive potential, but until it's proven, and there are lots of studies and lots of examples, field examples of it all working, again, there's a bit of skepticism. But it's definitely something that we've been involved with in terms of looking at the mineralogical content of cap rocks, and doing various lab experiments to prove that they have that sort of smectite content that you need, and then looking at the pressures, at potential for creeping, as opposed, or as in addition to swelling capabilities, just to try and fill those annular spaces. Ideally, actually, where there's no cement is obviously better, but it has to travel a bit further. But there's been lots of examples, for example, on the Shell Brent fields, and places like Ida in the Norwegian sector, but it's not being used with anger yet. And again, it's the chicken and egg scenario. In order to be able to use it more, people want to see it used more, but in order to use it more, you need to use it more. So it's a circular argument, unfortunately. But yeah, it definitely has massive potential, I think, particularly in those very sort of shallow overburden plugs where you have a prevalence of this very thick shale sequences. They're slightly overpressured. They cause problems during drilling. There's well bore stability issues as you drill through them. So there's lots of clues, even without the sort of hard evidence from lab work. So yeah, big potential.
So I think there's potential, Sergio, for another follow-up edition, whether during a workshop or during one of our Tech Tuesdays, to compare this shale as a barrier research currently done. I know some actors in Brazil are quite active. It would be interesting to compare what has been researched in various areas of the world.
Yeah, let's plan for it then. Up to it, no problem.
So 3 minutes to go before the hard stop on our event. Plans A, B, and C. Absolutely. And then I think maybe on your presentation, Ruth, the area or maybe a line which could show the $4 signs would be the cost of failure. Because if you don't right the first time, with the second time, if you have to remediate, it's going to be very costly. So it explains, I think, why, in the balancing act and moving your minimum safe abandonment depth, because you think, I'm not going to have to trip so deep. So you kind of put yourself in a corner where if something fails, then you have no more safety net. So I think combining good practices and potentially also the industry would have so much to benefit from learning from failure, sharing failures, so sharing the hard stuff, not just the success stories that you proudly present at conferences, but also things that have not worked for you.
I think there's everybody wins if you share in decommissioning. We're not in competition as such. We're all trying to make it safe and effective. We should absolutely be talking about the failures, about the problems, about the issues. We're actually taking steps in the UK to set up a geoscience excellence and decommissioning forum to share data, not just that we were talking about shale barrier data, but also to share experiences. And so in terms of, what did you do? How did you deal with this? What issues did you encounter for the subsurface? But obviously this is a wider conversation that needs to be happening with those absolutely executing the wells as well, and the operators. So we are trying to make strides in terms of building those communication pathways, sharing data, and getting a conversation going, particularly around the subsurface, because I think if there's anything that you take home from that presentation is that if you can remove a barrier from your well abandonment strategy, or if you can, reduce your scope in any way, it's a massive, massive opportunity, but it has to be done right. And it's not just done to save money. It has to be done based on good technical evidence. But it is a huge opportunity. And I in my experience of talking to lots of people lately about decommissioning and abandonment of wells, the subsurface is really something that doesn't really crop up in conversation that often. So I'm really keen to sort of, to spread the word, and why I believe it's such an important part of the well decommissioning planning and execution phase as well.
Great, Ruth. Thank you very much. Pierre,
you're more than welcome.
I think it's perfect. It's a great, perfect final words.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and I'm truly happy, and I would like to thank you on behalf of SPE, and of course thank Pierre also, who is also bringing us those great presentations, and thank you very much. And of course, happy holidays, right? My favorite time of year. I guess that some people also like it. So happy holidays to you. Happy holidays to everyone who's watching us. And thank you very much, Ruth. Appreciate it. And
it's my pleasure.
Again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Happy holidays.
We hope to see you in person in Brazil at some point, and we'll be back.
That would be fantastic.
We'll be back. We'll be back in 2024 on the 16th of January with a presentation on subsea well response by Mike Cargill with Trendsetter Engineering.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye-bye.